This is CyberSound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity, with your hosts, Jason Pufall and Stephen Maresca.
Welcome to CyberSound. I'm your host, Jason Pufall, joined as always by Steve Maresca and Matt Facero.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, guys. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about a story that we saw recently where there's some, I guess I'll call them significant investments being made to the open source software community. And I say that because I think what was the number? $30 million potentially being pledged as an investment.
Yeah, as the initial funding.
Yeah, which, it's a fair amount of money, right? I don't know that it's going to mean that, the biggest change in some of these open source security platforms necessarily, but for us, I think the takeaway largely was it's great to see an investment being made by things like the Linux Foundation or frankly, right, the Amazon, Google, Microsoft, et cetera, large companies making investments in some of these open source projects.
Yeah, and I think their commitment is intended to increase over time. It's a reflection that they, even as companies that are producing proprietary software, are in some capacity dependent upon open source tools. And that's an interesting acknowledgement, especially for, Microsoft, which traditionally has, avoided this subject like the plague.
Mm-hmm. They've gotten better.
Yeah,
I will say that. I don't typically give Microsoft credit where it's not due, but they've done a decent job.
Oh man, I agree with you completely. It's just that the popular perception for 20 years has been the opposite.
Sure.
This is a relatively new trend that many people may not be aware of. I think that it's appropriate for investments to be made by the larger technology entities. But I do think it's important to say, for those who might not be aware, that open source products, open source projects in general, already have sort of implicit funding. Great example, Linux itself, the Linux kernel, Java as ecosystems, a lot of the application servers that exist, they're fundamentally built by staff employed explicitly by the bigger technology entities for no other purpose. Intel, for example, employs a boatload of engineers to implement hypervisors on their chips.
Oh yeah, their code shows up in quite a few projects. I mean, almost the entirety of the Apache project has corporate backing somehow, right? Whether it's just they literally will pay software engineers just to work on open source software, right? Even if they don't necessarily own the license to it, they rely on it so much that they need to make sure that it's kept up.
Yeah, I think for me, what I took away from this, as I started to think about the types of folks who are listening to the podcast, is using open source maybe as opposed to potentially using commercial products, right? And an investment like this, I think, is just sort of further evidence that those products are reasonably well maintained, often. They're securely written, with some significant potential peer review as a result of this, right? The takeaway is don't avoid open source necessarily just because you think it's not commercial off the shelf software.
Right. And I consider it sort of a false dichotomy. It's not open source or proprietary software. Most proprietary software these days, and I mentioned in sort of a prep for this episode, VMware, just as sort of a example case, their platform, their virtualization platform, has an enormous disclosure list of open source software. And really the dynamic between open source or proprietary is how much are you willing as an organization to support it yourselves with your own staff.
And licensing probably.
Exactly. That's really the decision between one or the other. The context that we're talking about here in terms of funding explicitly for security projects, for security maintenance, really, I think, is a reflection that open source software is innate. It's embedded in the underpinnings of the internet. It's in the really, really profound tools that we use as technologists. And therefore, as sort of a foundational element, needs to be shored up, needs to be audited, needs to be improved.
Yeah, I mean, they specifically call out a few things in here, which I agree with. There's a lot of projects that are highly utilized, but are written in either old languages, quite honestly, that just aren't up to the standards that we have now. So they're looking to convert a lot of those things. I believe they specifically called out C and C++, which I found funny. One thing that I definitely want to address in this is that they're saying that their total investment, that they're estimating 150 million. I think they're way off on that one.
You think they should invest more? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you just think about the cost of a developer these days, you're talking, depending on your location, you're talking anywhere between like 75,000 to 300 grand, depending on what you're asking them to do, right? Or to put a project together. On that scale, you got a decent sized team, but they're not going to solve all of open source problems with 500.
Yeah, I think we're talking about magnitudes that are more in line with corporate valuations as being necessary to support the ecosystem appropriately. This is a starting point, and it's not exactly the first time it's happened. There are bug bounties and public support for security as an end in general, but this is a really substantial reinvigoration of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of this probably came out of something like the Log4j.
I believe that as well.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, that was mostly unmaintained for a while. I believe there was one contributor that wrote the entire thing, and then it sat. And then we had that whole situation. Right.
I think it's a recognition that a lot of perceived to be mature and, quote unquote, finished software is embedded everywhere.
Right.
And it just requires attention and care and feeding, just like everything else.
Right. I was going to say, go ahead.
Elements of this plan that they're, helping to deliver and fund with the 150 million potential investment include educating and certifying developers in secure programming, creating actual metrics for reporting security, essentially trying to facilitate security as an overall practice and discipline. We're talking about even during security incidents, code review, that type of thing. It's broader as a subject.
So I have nothing to say now, because it's exactly what I was going to say, which is I like the emphasis on the training aspect, right? The emphasis on ensuring that secure code is being developed. I think that's really important. It's not just about creating tools.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Access to tools too, right, is important. And what I mean by that is, back when I was writing more software than I do these days, one of the hardest things to do was to use some of the more unattainable analysis tools that you could put your code through for things like that'll do analysis to uncover bugs that you may have introduced, right? Those things cost thousands of dollars at the time. Now, I mean, it's either completely available for free, or hopefully projects like these are going to make those things available to developers a little within grasp, right?
It used to be the case that if you were an open source project of some kind in a provable fashion, you could make a request of a company providing one of those tools, and they might have a program for providing it, not for resale license or something like that. But that was an exception rather than the norm. These days,
and usually went to unmonitored email boxes.
Exactly. These days, it's sort of a more community good effort that's actually part of public relations, I'd say.
Yes, I agree.
So I don't know if there's a ton more to talk about necessarily relative to this. I think it's mostly we wanted to make sure we brought it to folks' attention, because I think the investment is definitely important. Good.
I would say, in general, it's important to understand that open source software is no more or less secure than closed source software, and the same is true in the other direction. It's about quality of security practice. It's about diligence of actual developers. And the truth is that when you're building a product, whether it be for fun, for an open source project, for an enterprise that is trying to ship something quickly, emphasis is not always on secure coding. And it takes effort that is orthogonal to the actual effort of building that tool. Therefore, security is always a secondary process and second thought, regardless of the type of software. So this is essentially a statement to say, don't fear open source security. The investment is not necessarily an expression of a problem. It's an encouraging statement that the big players in the industry are trying to support something they know that is shared between all of them.
Yeah, and if you're bringing an open source project into your your security stack, or even if it's not security, if you're bringing open source in, just do a little research on how it's actually supported. If you go and look at a a project on GitHub and there's 800 open issues and no one's addressing them, probably not the best option of integrating in your environment, right?
Right. Actually, that it's an interesting point in the sense of when you're doing an evaluation of, you say, commercial software, maybe a SaaS vendor or something, like you've got tools to turn to, right? They might have some sort of cloud assessment that they've done, or they might have a SOC 2 that talks about their company. It might be a little trickier in some of the open source projects to really understand what the security risks might be, short of spending some time combing through some of the resources that are there.
Yeah, and there's a lot more resources available these days than there used to be as well. I mean, there's even built-in tools on a lot of the projects now that will scan for those types of things.
And plenty of open source projects that have code audit attestations.
Exactly.
And
Oh,
similar.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a different landscape today.
Okay. I mean, if people are interested in sort of getting a better understanding of that, you can Google the open source software security mobilization plan. That'll give you some clarity into what we're talking about as well, and bring up a whole variety of articles sort of on this subject if there's interest. As always, right? If anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about it or wants to chat with us about it, hit us up on LinkedIn at Vancord or Vancord Security at Twitter. We're happy to continue the conversation. And with that, we hope somebody took something away from this, got a little bit of value, and we appreciate everybody listening.
Stay vigilant. Stay resilient. This has been CyberSound.